Long COVID doesn't just mess with your body and your brain. The psychology of it can have incredibly destructive effects too. Depression and anxiety are widely documented, but what's a slightly more controversial topic is the role that psychology might also have to aid recovery. Now, of course, before the pitchforks get readied, I will say again, long COVID is a complex multi-system disease that is very, very real, and hypochondria plays literally zero role in its presentation. But that doesn't mean that a holistic approach to treatment can't be effective. I've been doing quite a bit better in the last couple of months, and for once feel like I can properly see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that it's not about to just go out on me again like it has done a few times in the past. So what's made the difference? Well, in this presentation I made at the TLC conference, I talk about my journey with long COVID from the start, the reason why I started making these films, the reason why I continued, and ultimately what I think might have led to my own personal breakthrough more than a year after becoming ill. And for reference, it's not just me. If you talk to those who've recovered either from long COVID or ME/CFS, they'll often tell a pretty similar story. So I hope you find it useful. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about the psychology of long COVID, because this isn't something I've spoken too much about on YouTube, actually. I mean, I made a film about the mental health implications of it very early on, but I've not spoken about it that much recently. And I think I've come to a slightly different perspective now. So just as I'll whiz through here, my previous life, I was a filmmaker. This is me on set. I made movies, documentaries, commercials. And if anyone's interested, a little plug, my movie After Death is actually on TV tonight in the UK on the Horror Channel. So if you're up late, check that out. And as Tina mentioned, I was very fit and active, as a disproportionate amount of long haulers seem to be, actually. And this was me in March training. Tina's already mentioned that. A few days later, had a relatively mild initial infection. I was feeling quite smug with my friends, because basically everybody in London got it in March. There seemed like there was a period of about a week or two where literally it just absolutely exploded through the whole city because nobody was socially distancing, everybody was inside, nobody was wearing masks, and it just blew up everywhere. And my friends had it at the same time, and they had a much rougher week or two, and I felt quite smug. I thought, oh, look how much better my immune system is because I'm so fit. However, you know, a few weeks go past and I'm not better. They're back to normal and I'm not. And I thought, you know what, let me look at some of the science out there in terms of what we understand about post-viral fatigue and what we know at the moment about COVID-19. Is there some basis for ongoing symptoms here? And I sort of made this film and just put it out there on my YouTube channel, and I wasn't sure if it would find an audience, but it found an audience really, really quickly because I wasn't the only one. And this was in April, you know, who hadn't got better after that initial infection. And this was sort of the start of me going down the rabbit hole, really, in terms of doing a lot of my own research. This film's has had over 1 million views now. And this was basically looking into why long haulers seemed to test negative for antibodies. It's not necessarily that we didn't have antibodies. It's more that we were just falling underneath the calibration threshold. But it does seem that, you know, certainly the antibody response of long haulers was potentially different to other groups. And again, this has been reflected in a study that's come out fairly recently, actually, that's been published in a journal. I also looked into what the symptoms were that people are experiencing. This had quite a big response to this survey. Nobody was talking about sore throat at the time being the most common first symptom, but there we go. I looked at recovery as well. And found at 6 months, this was, I looked at 12 months as well, but at 6 months here, 93% of long haulers weren't able to work as they could pre-COVID. So it looked like the recovery curve here was really quite extended, and we weren't really hitting what I was hoping was the sort of the middle of this bell distribution curve at 6 months, or indeed at 12 months. I also looked at some pre-existing conditions and risk factors for long COVID, and found that being atopic, that is, if you have asthma or eczema or hay fever, or certain other autoimmune conditions, you'd be more likely or more at risk to get long COVID. And I also did a study, the first one to I jumped the gun and was the first one to look at vaccine reactions amongst long haulers, and found that more people tended to feel better than worse, although some people do have negative reactions to the vaccine. And again, you know, more research is needed around all of this. This is a huge topic, really. So why did I do all of this? And the answer was, it kind of gave me a sense of control over this illness, because it really, for most of 2020, GPs didn't know what the hell you were talking about if you said you weren't still feeling well. Sort of the medical world was lagging behind the patients, and it was the patients who were doing the research, and all of us were just out there in the dark trying to work out what was going on. And it gave me some semblance of control over a condition in which you have none, right? Because you don't know what the treatments are, you don't know what the prognosis is, you wake up every day feeling different, sometimes better, sometimes worse. And actually making these films gave me a sense of control over that. And that was my own personal coping mechanism. It helped a lot of people too. And that was also very rewarding. But it was a bit of a coping mechanism for me because, I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't do a bunch of the other stuff I used to do. I couldn't, make my movies anymore. I couldn't make YouTube films like this one, for example, which actually I've made but never published because it seemed inappropriate. Stuff like this. That's what I wanted to be doing. And instead I found myself making films like this and talking about mental health. And that's partly because I think I've got a list of questions here. And I think anybody who's suffered from long COVID will identify with a bunch of these questions. And these are things that go through your head so frequently. Like you probably won't get past 2 or 3 minutes before one of these will go through your head. So I'll just run through them. The first obvious one: when am I going to get better? Am I going to be able to do this thing? Is it a phone call? Is it a, going to the shops? Is it, utterly trick? Can I just deal with my emails? Can I do the hoovering? Can I do my washing? Am I going to be able to do that tomorrow or next week? You can't make plans. Everything suddenly becomes incredibly uncertain. Why am I feeling so terrible today? If I am feeling terrible, it's my fault. What did I do to make this happen? There's a lot of self-blame and self-judgment that goes on here. Am I ever going to get better? And this is the other really difficult thing here, where you feel like you're in this sort of long tunnel. And sometimes you think you can see the light at the end of the tunnel and you get excited and it gets a little bit closer. And then, you feel terrible again. You have a relapse and that light goes out. And that's really hard psychologically to deal with. What's actually happening in my body? Why does no one know what's happening? Why is there not more research already? How long does it take the medical establishment to do some of this stuff that we feel should be obvious? What could I possibly take or do that will make me feel better? Why have I suddenly got this new symptom 6 months in? For me, this was tachycardia and palpitations that started 6 months in, just came out of nowhere. And again, I put it in there twice because this one comes around so often. Am I ever going to get better? I thought I was improving. Why am I getting worse? Personally, this is one for me. I got better after having post-viral fatigue about 20 years ago, and I got better quite quickly after 12 months. But I'm at 15 months now. Why am I still not right? How much have I spent on treatment, prescriptions, medicines? How much have I lost in terms of work I've not been able to do? What's the toll on my relationships and the people around me and my family and my friends? And am I ever going to get better? So I've just put a little flag up here, a little bit like a spoiler before a film review, about a controversial opinion coming up. And I think one of the sort of things that I think we all get very sort of obsessed by is how we sort of interrupt this cycle that's going on. And Ashok talked about this earlier today. And I just ought to also state as well that this cycle here, I'm sort of excluding the organ damage and endothelial damage, nerve damage, any of those sort of optional extras that long COVID throws out on top of sort of the engine of the disease itself. And obviously those, complications will need to be resolved in their own way. But fundamentally, it does seem like there is this cycle going on between the brain and the body, and this negative feedback loop, if you like, where all the elements there in the body feed back to the brain, and the brain is all over the place. This sympathetic nervous system overdrive, our guts aren't working properly either. We've got tachycardia, we're sweating. There's all this mad stuff that's going on, and it just goes round and round. So how do we stop this? And the answer is, as has been spoken about in the conference so far, there are a number of interventions that we can do that help break this cycle. But this is where it gets a bit controversial, because there is a third part of this system, and that is the mind. And where I think a lot of the stigma has been out in this space before, certainly around ME and CFS, comes from a conflation of the brain and the mind. And this idea that, oh, you just think you're ill, therefore you are ill. And I think the answer for me here is that the brain and the mind are two very separate entities, but we can't ignore the mind when it comes to treating ourselves holistically. And a good example of this is the webinar that I shared recently of Dr. Paul Glynn talking about how he recommends treating long COVID. And the first two things on his list was managing anxiety and stress. And that's because of the impact that those have on that feedback loop between the brain and the body. And the mind is intrinsically involved in all of this too. And all of those questions that go round our head every 2 minutes are not helping. Fundamentally, anything that's going through your head that wasn't a thought that you would have had before you had long COVID isn't necessarily helping you get better. And there is no shortage of science. If you watch my recent interview with Professor Tommy Wood, he talks about this a bit, showing that how what we think is going on can affect physiological responses. So we do have to think about what goes on in the mind and what the psychology of long COVID is, and trying to make sure that that doesn't perpetuate this negative cycle. Now, it's not necessarily going to get us better by itself, but I do think that it is a key part of us having the best possible chance of recovery. And the trap here is that this obsession over our symptoms and over how unwell we are and what we can do and why there isn't more research and maybe this drug or maybe that drug, that cycle of thought, I think, leads to this sort of highly sort of stressful state, this emotional involvement in the condition, and perpetuates the sympathetic nervous system response, that fight or flight response. So we get stuck in that system where we never actually get out of our own heads enough to actually see the wood for the trees. So what do I think that we can do to break this cycle? And I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience here over the last couple of months, where I feel like, I mean, touch all the wood in the world, you know, my big wooden head, about feeling like maybe I am actually seeing the light at the end of the tunnel for good this time. I haven't had a protracted spell like this with as much functionality at any other point in my long COVID experience. And there's a few things that I think have contributed to that. For example, the last 6 of the 8 days, I have done 12 or 13-hour shifts in the back of an ambulance because I'm also training to be a paramedic at the moment. And there is no way I could have done 6 13-hour shifts in an 8-day period. Even 2 or 3 months ago, I would have crashed really hard and really quickly. And right now, I'm actually okay. A bit of a headache this morning, but I'm okay. So the first thing is to essentially manage the symptoms. And for me, that's the obvious first key one of pacing, which has always been key and will always continue to be key until we're 100%. Antihistamines, I'm quite MCAS-y, so I do need those. Melatonin helps me sleep. Escitalopram, again, SSRI, sort of mood regulator and helps with the serotonin. Aspirin helps with blood flow. I think Paul Glynn spoke about that. We are a little bit cloggy and clotty as long haulers. A ton of supplements, too many to list. And I have also done a couple of courses of ivermectin. These were sort of a little way back. And the other big factor here, I think, for me is time. And for me, I maybe just got to the point in time where it was possible for me to turn the corner, but there was still a bunch of stuff I had to do. And I'm just interrupting this flow here with this slide here. And if you look at these questions on here, and if you identify with any of these questions, you're probably where I was for the first 12 months of my experience. And it's really, really hard to get past this stuff. But I feel that getting past this stuff is absolutely key, because until then, we are a knot of emotion and we are not of tension. And none of that helps to contribute to a nervous system that functions normally, especially when it's hypersensitized. So For me, I think the key things to getting better recently and letting go, if you like, of long COVID have been a huge amount of emotional release. And that has come in a few different ways. So daily breath work, meditation, and visualization. And this has been inspired by the Gupta program. I haven't followed the Gupta program religiously, but I've taken the elements from it that worked for me and adapted them and used them in the way that makes sense to me. And they have been really helpful. There's at the risk of getting him booked up so that I can never see him again. There's a guy called Sam K. His surname is Sri Lankan and unpronounceable. Who works at Cell Wellness Centre in London, and he is incredible. He's an acupuncturist and cranial osteopath. And he made a huge difference to me. And I've also been in sort of regular counseling as well. And again, all of this stuff, I think, has helped me unlock a lot of the tied up emotion that I had around the injustice, if you like, of long COVID. And just trying to let go of that tension and actually just accept where I was. Because until you get to that place of acceptance, you can't really begin to find your way back to a normal balance point. So involved in that as well are things like interrupting the thought patterns that go through your head, that those questions that come past every single time. How do you interrupt them? How do you get past them? How do you stop thinking them? So trying to change your mindset. If you can, change your environment, even if it's only for a short period of time, to a place which you don't associate with the condition, where you do something new, something exciting. I was lucky enough to go down to Yotown in Devon a few weeks ago, and that was an incredible environment. And that was, I mean, at the risk of sounding a bit woo-woo, really healing, you know. Be as active as you can within your limits. Some people have found yoga incredibly helpful, and I would say that's the right sort of activity you want, or gentle walking, whatever you can. Obviously be aware of your limits, but don't let the fact that there is a limit there stop you doing anything. I think we do still have to be active. We do still have to be outward looking. This is a really important one. Don't identify with the condition. So stop calling yourself ill if you possibly can. Don't call yourself, you know, there's a lot of people I see on Twitter called anonymous long hauler or whatever, that they have so identified with the condition that it becomes their name. And I think separating yourself from that is really important. For me as well, less time spent on long COVID social media where you're caught up in this bubble of these thought patterns and this sort of cycle. The other part as well, hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Again, being able just to force me to lie down and breathe for like an hour and a half at a time, as well as any sort of stimulation that it gives to the rest of your mitochondrial system and everything else, has also been really helpful for me. But it is really hard, and it does take time. It doesn't happen quickly. I feel like it's taken me 2 or 3 months from the realization that this is where I needed to go to get to this place. It's taken me that long, and it's not an easy process, and letting go of all of this stuff isn't easy. And hopefully the idea is that if we intervene on each of these different sort of parts of the framework, from the body, you know, to the brain, to the mind, and we can intervene on all of these things, we give ourselves the best possible chance of recovering and letting our body find its way back to homeostasis, because the virus it's come along and knocked us massively out of whack. How do we find our way back to where we were before, or a new normal, or wherever that is? And I feel that having an understanding of our psychology and where we're at in all this can be hugely important in terms of actually being able to turn the corner. So that's my piece. Tina, I don't know if you've got any questions.
I think that's marvellous. Thank you. That's absolutely brilliant. And I am so delighted that you were able to present today, because I think this is the last piece of the jigsaw, really. You know, we've talked about medication, we've talked about what's going on in the immunopathophysiology, we've talked about the brain with the Gupta program and so on. And actually the mind is also important, as you quite rightly point out. And the approach that you've taken is fantastic. And I completely get that for patients who are stuck in a very difficult place, which has also been a very lonely and scary place for them for a long time, it's quite difficult to make that change in their perception. But it is so worthwhile doing it, because all of my patients who have managed to do this have started to see a great improvement in everything else that we're trying to do for them. And so it just, yeah, absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. The interesting you said about cranial osteopathy. I've had quite a few patients do that, and they found it very helpful. And also the acupuncture. I'm taking down his name and number.
Yes.
I've got a few patients who I'm thinking definitely need to see him.
Yes, he's extraordinary. He is extraordinary.
Is he?
I mean, yeah, one of the challenges that I've had in terms of doing this is separating myself from my advocacy and my work.
Yeah.
Because that was an extension of me, and it came out of a place where I needed to fix myself. So I was doing this stuff to try and get there, and actually to try and say, you know what, I'm not going to be obsessed by this. I'm not going to let it define me. I'm actually going to treat it like work and create this separation between me as a human and the work I do. I think because that's also been something that's been really important for me too. And
I think there was also a very interesting interview you did with Dr. Wood. Or Wood, is it Woods?
Tommy Wood, yeah.
Tommy Wood in Seattle, an English doctor who works in Seattle. And he was talking about learning something different, doing some distractional therapy, really, so that you're not thinking about your condition, but you're learning a new language, or you're trying to paint a picture, or something that takes you right out of yourself and is completely all-consuming. And it just gives you that break from that mindset that just can spiral and spiral. So he was a really interesting interview there, I thought.
Yeah.
And the creatine and the various other things, mitochondria. So he was looking at the cellular level, but also also he said, practice your balancing. Walk along a plank. Try and stay on the cracks in the pavement. Try and get your balance right. And we know that is very important for various parts of the brain. And it's very distracting. If you're concentrating on that, it gives you a break from the other stuff.